Well, greetings, brethren. Thank you for joining us here today on another edition of the Shepherd's Voice Magazine YouTube channel. And today is Christmas Day that I'm recording this on. And so tomorrow is the 26th, but otherwise I'm just going to, if you're watching on the premiere day, the Sabbath day, then I'll just wish you a Merry Sabbath. How's that sound? Actually, so many people have been wishing me a Merry Christmas lately. And either on Messenger or when I'm out and about, or people on my email and these things like that. Or so many people are wishing me happy holidays, or basically Merry Christmas, and I've been trying to find ways around it all the time. I'm trying to say, I usually say, have a merry day, have a merry breakfast, hope you have a merry afternoon. But I think the best way to get around is to say sometimes it's happy holidays. But it is December, and every year, I think just about every year, Hanukkah is celebrated in December. I think it could also be in November, but it recently ended on December 18th. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that briefly, because it's an event that was prophesied by Daniel, and we'll go to Daniel chapter 11 and look at what happened there, what that festival relates to. But Hanukkah is that Jewish festival that's commemorating the recovery of Jerusalem and the subsequent rededication of the Second Temple. But the Maccabean revolt was was what this commemorates as well, against the Seleucid Empire, where Antiochus Epiphanes was the head of it. Antiochus was his name, and Epiphanes is something he added to himself, and later on it was changed again, but that's getting to digressing. But this is back in the 2nd century BC, and it's also known as the Festival of Lights. So it's an 8 or 9 day festival that occurs. But at that point in time, back in the 2nd century BC, it was a devastating time for the Jews, but also foreshadows what is also going to happen in the future. And that's what we're going to focus on a little bit here. So we're going to talk about some of the prophetic words that relate to this in Daniel, and how Daniel describes it here in chapter 11, or how it's described to him, rather. But we'll also take a look at it as an advanced lesson for ourselves today. So let's take a look. So let's go Daniel chapter 11, and let's just pick it up here in verse 21, when this Antiochus of the Seleucid Empire comes into the scene in the prophecy. So chapter 11, and this is going to carry on here in verse 21. And in his place shall rise a vile person, not very nice, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peacefully and seize the kingdom by intrigue. So all this part here in Daniel chapter 21, when you go through Daniel here and all these events here, it talks a lot about history that was fulfilled. But most of the attention here is going to be on this character, this vile person, which turned out to be Antiochus. But he had a lot of successful endeavors, military endeavors, but I think the reason why, of course, much is being paid to him, because he foreshadows the Antichrist that will come in the future. But in verse 21 here, he seized the kingdom by intrigue. So he wasn't the rightful heir, but he seized it anyway. He seized the throne of the empire, and you can look at the story on how that occurred. Then we're going to skip over here to get towards more what we want to be talking about here, up here in verse 28. All right. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so that he shall do damage and return to his own land. So he turned his attention to Israel's wealth and the wealth of the temple, and plundered it and defiled it, and abolished the sacrifices. And in the process, according to Josephus, the historian Josephus, killed about 8,000 people at that time. So let's keep reading. And at the appointed time he shall return and not go towards the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For the ships from Cyprus shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and shall show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. So he wanted to go to Egypt, essentially as the story goes in history, again, but because the first time I think he did wasn't as entirely successful, but he wanted to go again, but the emerging Roman Empire, their ships prevented him, and so he turned his frustration on the Jews. And so, as it says here, he returned in rage against the Holy Covenant. So that's what he did, and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. So there's some in Israel at the time were like renegade Jews who abandoned the Mosaic law. So he showed them favor. And a lot of these folks of this type, they found it more expedient to see it through the empire's interest than any covenant they had with God. So they're kind of playing this game. So at one point here, he sent 22,000 troops on the Sabbath. This is part of the historical record. And they came in peacefully, and they did that on the Sabbath because the Jews would be more reluctant to defend themselves on the Sabbath day. And he desecrated this temple, and he put up pig sacrifice and started pig sacrifice and put Zeus in there. And this is the abomination, this image of Zeus, as I understand it, which relates to the abomination of desolation. So that's what's picked up here in verse 31. So he's got some allies there, some Jews who, they're evidently, as I understand it, were leaders in the politics there, and it's got them, kind of flattered them and got them in on his side. And forces shall be mustered by him, which I think is the 22,000 soldiers, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. And they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there an abomination of desolation. So he came in peacefully first, and then he just did all this damage. And then it says here, those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. So Antiochus deceived many Jews with his flattery and his promises, and they also apparently, some of these Jews participated in the worship of Zeus as well. So he was a master at manipulating the Jewish leaders who were divided in their loyalties. They had loyalty to God, and they had loyalty to the secular institution of which he was representing. So he won them over to his cause by these glowing promises of preferment and reward. Sounds like a good deal, right? And so, as a matter of fact, Antiochus already had partisans there for his cause in a considerable number, according to the record. And all these were influential leaders in Jerusalem society and politics. I guess they were still convinced of the expediency of pro-Hellenistic policy, or the Greek way, these Jews. So this became a time of testing and refining of the Jewish people as we read on through here. Submit to God or submit to some other secular gods and the leaders. So let's keep reading. Let's just keep. And these people here, but the people who know their God, verse 32, shall be strong and carry out exploits, who knew their God. So they didn't have divided loyalties. They weren't like so many of these other Jews who, as he said here, forsake the Holy Covenant. So this was first a small group of Jews. It started out this way, and now it was called, I think it was led to, is called the Maccabean revolt. And many had laid down their lives. Let's keep reading. And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, for yet many days they shall fall by sword and flame, they are burned by captivity and plundering. And when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join them with intrigue. So we see these Jews that laid down their lives because they were loyal to their covenant with God and fought back. So they got a little bit of encouragement from their apostate brethren. It says, oh yeah, you're doing good. I like what we're seeing. But then when they started gaining momentum, some of them actually joined their numbers, but did not quite break with their pro-Hellenistic loyalties or their secular loyalties, but they still joined in. They're essentially with hypocrites. They're kind of like hypocrites, I guess, in a sense, or in a very real sense, to be honest with you, with their securities and the empire's preferences, but flattering themselves and others with their pro-covenant outward expressions, perhaps. And this is probably how it went. In fact, the Maccabees had to purge their own ranks when this was over and executed many of these hypocritical, where they got their legs in both camps. Well, we'll join you. And then, but the reality was that they will join them by intrigue, and they actually executed many of them, of their fellow Jews. They had to cleanse. They had to purify and get rid of them. And this is evidently what happened. So now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, and many shall join them with intrigue. And then verse 35, and some of those of understanding shall fall, to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it is still for an appointed time. Okay. So purified and made white. And I think this is something here that speaks to what will happen in the future as well. And these folks here are not forgotten. They're not forgotten. And I do think we'll see them in the first resurrection, not some secondary resurrection 1,000 years way out in the future. But I believe we'll see them in the first resurrection. There was that multitude spoken of in Revelation. There's also the 144,000. But because this event here is so tied to the future event of the Great Tribulation, the 144,000, I think a lot of them may have come out of this event. And sometimes the 144,000 of these tribes of Israel is sometimes used as a proof text for saying, well, the nations, they must be distinct somehow in the modern times. And so they kind of say, well, there'll be 12,000 from the United States, 12,000 from England, or all this kind of thing. But it's a silly proof text. You can't use it. But I don't want to digress from that. But I do believe that these here, purified, made white, until the time of the end, because it's still an appointed time. So I do think we'll see these in the first resurrection, and I do believe, me personally, they'll make most of, or quite a bit of, the 144,000, which is really a governmental body to teach. And when Israel comes, the physical Israel again is restored. And these would be the best candidates I can think of. But that's just this side case. But in the end, the empire under Antiochus killed tens of thousands of Israelites, and women and children were taken away as slaves. So it was just an awful time, and tens of thousands of the Seleucid Empire military were killed by the Jews. So just was a lot of death and destruction and an abomination of desolation. Just all a very difficult time. But in the end, the temple was cleansed and rededicated, and it's such an extraordinary event that occurred at this time that's still celebrated to this day. Still celebrated to this day. So I just want to do here now a little prophetic interlude, if you don't mind, for a couple of reasons. Now, when you read chapter 11, and you read through this history here, and somewhere along the line, it goes from events of history, past history, our past history, is Daniel's future. But eventually it goes to the point where the time of the end. So we read all these events, and we can point to these events that are occurring in history, and right up here to Antiochus, right to this event here, or to the Maccabean revolt. But somewhere it transitions to the future, our future. And if we're not careful and not carefully looking at it, we may miss it or misinterpret it. So I just want to bring this up because some mistakenly make the break in going from the past and before Christ's time to the future too early in chapter 11. I just recently was looking at some material that was sent to me a year ago, or somebody I know from the Church of God and the argument here is basically, when you read here in verse 31 of this abomination of desolation, well, Christ prophesied an abomination of desolation, did he not? Didn't he do this in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15? So the mistake some make is to say, well, this must be future. And it's not. This is the mistake that is a make. The break occurs here between verse 35 and 36, which we'll discuss here in just a minute. But Christ speaks of the abomination of desolation in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, and chapter 12 and verse 11. Not Daniel chapter 8, verse 13, and 11:31. These are two separate events. So again, Christ speaks of the abomination of desolation that is mentioned in chapter 9 and verse 27 and chapter 12 and verse 11. The one we just read about is something that occurred in the past. But these two events are related. There's a time difference, but there is a key relationship that we don't want to overlook between the two, and I'll try to make that connection. So, they're separate events, but not yet necessarily independent of each other. If we look, for example, at Daniel chapter 8, let's go back here in chapter 8 of Daniel. When I'm talking about this connection, and for the sake of time, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. In verse 13, the abomination of desolation is mentioned. This is the same one that we were just talking about in the 2nd century BC. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, giving both the sanctuary and the host be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 days, and the sanctuary will be cleansed." Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, and I was seeking the meaning, and suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, who called and said, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, "Understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end." So now we may start to think, well, wait a minute. Didn't Jim just say that this chapter 8 and verse 13 has occurred in the past, in the 2nd century BC? Wait a minute. This is the time of the end. And here's where we need to be careful, because you clearly, when you read the interpretation here, you see again, we can't spend too much time in it. We see the Media, the Medes, and the Persians, and of Greece coming here, and then the broken horn, and 4 kingdoms shall rise out of that nation, but not with its power. So those 4 generals that came out of Alexander the Great. So he's not referring to the time of the end, but yet it says here the time of the end. So clearly in chapter 8, when we read the discussion, it leads us to the time of Antiochus. But the vision relates to the last days as well. This is not an unusual element of prophecy, relating the near or now to the far future. We see this in other prophetic teachings or the prophetic texts. So we need to be careful with that. So even though he says in the latter days, this is referring at the end time, our future end time, when Christ returns, even though leading up to those events when Christ returns, there's a relationship there. I hope I'm making myself clear. So the former fulfillment and the latter fulfillment, there's a tie there. And we want to learn from that former fulfillment so we can prepare ourselves perhaps more in the future. So this is a minimum, but we see here that was experienced in chapter 11 is a minimum, a precursor to the abomination of desolation and the experience that surround it to the one in the future. It'll bring out the best and the worst of people. Certainly will, including Christians and Jews and everyone else. And the Son of Man will judge that. So with that, let's continue here. I just want to bring that little interlude together so that there won't be any confusion to say, well, Jim, what are you talking about? The abomination of desolation is future. How come you talking about it's in the past? No, I hope that helps clarify that just in case. I can't be sure. So, let's pick it up here again in verse 35. And some of those who understanding shall fall, to refine them, to purify them, and make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for an appointed time. And then there's this sort of break that occurs here. This is where the break between the past and the future Antichrist comes. Then the king, now the angel doesn't make it too clear, but why doesn't he make it clear to us? Because perhaps the angel is just subtly saying, what just was described here is not so unrelated to the events in the future. At least that's what my take is. At least that's what I see it. In verse 36, and the king, and all this up to this point in time, it's the king of the north and the king of the south. King of the north, king of the south. But then it says here, the king, so we don't know how to identify who it is. So we see that kind of break already occurring. The king shall do according to his own will. This is called a willful king. He shall exalt and magnify himself above every god, shall speak blasphemies against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the wrath has been accomplished. For what has been determined shall be done. All right, so then there's more descriptions of him that comes along here. So there's a distinct break there that the angel is subtly putting in there for us. Here we have in verse 36 is really none other than the Antichrist or the lawless one, or that little horn that's described, I believe, in chapter 7. This is who this is. But let's just read on a little bit. Let's go pick up here in verse 39. Thus he shall act against the strongest fortresses with a foreign god, and he shall acknowledge and advance its glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and divide the land for gain. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him with a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall also enter the glorious land, and in many countries he shall be overthrown, but these shall escape with his hand. Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. So in verse 44, this guy is a vile person too, but news from the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. So here we have a willful king, another vile person that's on a larger and more global scale than Antiochus was. This could not be Antiochus because this guy here basically gets his way. Antiochus did not from the ships from Cyprus. So there's also that. But so when we read here in verse 40, there are some that actually start to think, well, so at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him. Now, is he the king of the north, or is he another king? Because it says the king of the north shall come against him. Namely, I think here, the king. So one could maybe argue, well, this is the king of the north. But I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about that. But we'll see how that, maybe someday we might find this play out, and we'll actually see it. But some are so convinced, well, he's got to be the king of the north, some European superpower, right? Not too fast, not so fast. We're not going to jump in and make those kinds of assumptions. But this individual is discussed in 2 Thessalonians, as we know. Let's go there. Let's go up here, way up to 2 Thessalonians. And Paul tells us a little bit about this individual, way up here. I'll make sure I pick up here's the first, and here's the second. All right, let's see what Paul has to say about this individual. Let's just pick it up here in verse 1 of chapter 2. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you, not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. So this is the same thing. This is the little horn. This is the fellow, the willful king, in verse 36 of chapter 11 of Daniel. And I want to point out here, when this falling away, this word apostasy, and I've written about it in an article back in 2012, I believe, and it hasn't been published on the web. It's just now getting put on there, and we'll have a link to it below that goes into more detail about some of what he's discussing here, and it relates. But this anarchy, where this falling away has often been used, well, it's a falling away of the brethren. Well, that's not true, and we need to look at that in a larger scale. This falling away is more of a worldwide anarchy that is occurring, or this kind of lawlessness. The systems are starting to fall apart because of this lawlessness. But you can read that article, and we'll explain it in a little more detail. So we see this guy here who opposes and exalts himself, verse 4, above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So in all intents and purposes, we shall see this, or we can see this, is that this willful king is the same. It is like the little horns that dislodges three other kings and becomes this pompous, saying pompous words and vile words. And he'll even stand up against Christ at some point and try to fight him. I'm not sure how those things will play out, but this is how this person who is being identified. So the question we'll ask here, why is God allowing such a person to gain such influence and short-term military success? Why is God allowing this to happen? Well, essentially, God will use them to judge wicked people, and in a sense, maybe broaden that. We're going to broaden that out a little bit here for us, because it'll expose the nature of mankind's rebelliousness against Him. So that these people will be siding with this. Nations and peoples will be siding with this willful king and throwing their loyalty behind him, because he's offering them this security. And he will bring out the best and worst in people. And maybe that's what God is intending to find out. The best and worst of people, as particularly those who might be professing to know God. If we take any lesson from the story of the Maccabean revolt, Jews and Christians of all types, he'll bring out the worst. It'll be a time of testing. So Antiochus did it, and there's something we need to think about here, is like Antiochus came and he offered, favors and loyalties and preferential treatment and security and all these kinds of things. So the question you might want to ask yourself is, well, what do you think this Antichrist, this lawless one, is there something you want, the lawless one? Is there something he has that he might offer you? I just want to put it out there. You say, oh, absolutely no way. Well, to think twice about that. What is it you're looking for? I mean, this is a time of testing. I remember in engineering school, it was like, the professor said, well, there's really no need to give you tests. We'll just teach you the material. But the reason why we test you is because we believe you don't understand the material. Otherwise, there'd be no need to test you. So there's that. That's something to consider. But is there something the lawless one might want, that would be offering you, that you might want? Something to think about. Something to think about. All right. Let's continue on here. Much of the tribulation events that Christ described in Matthew 24, and I think we'll go there in just a bit, relate to the epicenter of trouble in Jerusalem in particular. But I want to go here to Matthew chapter 24. Let's go there very quickly. I think it's this, at least for the sake of completion. Matthew 24. Oops. And we ask ourselves, well, we will be tested. Well, he describes a time of testing here. He talks about, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and says here in verse 9, and then they shall deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all my nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and betray one another and will hate one another, and many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because the lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations, and then the end will come. But as I say, much of the tribulation events that Christ talks about subsequently here are centered around Jerusalem or the land of, like a nation of Israel as it exists today. So much of this here, I have no reason to think the Abomination of Desolation will show up in Chicago. But in general, this will be a worldwide event. We see this because in the book of Revelation, and I'll just have the scripture here, you look at the Philadelphia church, Christ mentioned something to them. He says, but because you have kept, this is chapter 3 and verse 10 of Revelation, because you have kept my command to endure, I will also keep you from the hour of testing that is going to come over the whole world to test those who live on the earth. So it's a time of trial. And we'll find out, and God will see, and the Son of Man will judge it, the best and the worst. And that includes all Christianity and Jews as well. So it'll have worldwide effects, that's for sure. So let's talk about the whole world. Many look at the beast power, in Church of God circles I'm familiar with, as some foreign power in Europe. Many folk when they look into prophecy, they identify as a beast power as some amalgamation of 10 nations to look for in Europe somehow coming together. Because after all, it's like the king of the north, right? And at the same time, there's various arguments about what happened to America and the West. What's this? And this, well, I guess they fell apart or something. They were trying to say, not that easily believable, believe it or not, or fallen from God's favor or something to that effect, and or so we controlled by these foreign governments. But the new superpower will come out of the European Union or something to that effect. And so a lot of Christians spend a lot of time pointing in that direction, putting their energy into this kind of stuff, trying to warn people, this is what's happening, see, it's happening, trying to warn everyone all the time, pointing in that direction. Because it couldn't possibly happen here, right? We're just too righteous. We may have our problems, but we're definitely not any kind of we'll never get involved in something like that. I mean, we're friends with Israel, right? Well, not so fast, like I said. And I'll go back to Daniel. I think, had some more time here, but if you go back to Daniel, one of these events, things that even scholars and a lot of use as proof that it's somehow European is back here in Daniel chapter 7. And here he talks about a dream that he had and recorded the main facts. Daniel chapter 7. He had a dream and visions in his head while on his bed. He wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. And Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, the Mediterranean Sea. So all these beasts that are about to rise all come out of the Mediterranean Sea. And generally, this is what's used as, well, it must be European in its nature. As we go here, we won't read through all this. Let's read about this terrible 4th beast. All right. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, it had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words. So this beast, too, arises out. These great 4 beasts in verse 3 came up out of the sea, each different from the other. So it must be European, right? Well, not so fast. The interpretation gives us a little more information. Now, this is the Roman Empire that's come about, but the Roman Empire still exists in the great nations of today. And it's discussed more in detail here, and I do have it handy, From Babylon to America. It shows the influence of the Roman Empire and the systems and the way of government and language that still influences us today. And I'll probably do some session on that in the future to kind of really lay it out. But in verse 23, it says, thus he said, the 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it and break it in pieces. So it devours the whole earth. So it's not just limited to somewhere over there. It's everywhere, the whole earth. If you look in Daniel chapter 2 in the interpretation of when Christ came, that mountain came and did exactly the same expression here. The mountain came and grew. This is Christ's kingdom that replaces this one and took over the whole earth. So we can't just be focusing it on and pushing towards Europe all the time. I'm just putting that in there for some to consider. So Daniel, the whole earth was to do with the extent in which the Babylonian system has evolved to. And this, like I say, can easily be demonstrated. So the sway of the beast's power reaches all developed nations. Again, we're talking about the whole world now. The sway of this beast's power. Can you be swayed by it? Well, that's the question to ask ourselves, right? That is the question to ask ourselves, and I really want to drive that point home as well. Well, let's see here. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and let's continue reading a little bit. He points out here, he talks about this son of perdition, and he calls him the lawless one as he goes through. But he says, for the mystery of lawlessness tied to all this, the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out. He is taken out of the way. So this lawless one, the mystery of lawlessness, is already at work, swaying people towards the beast power direction, as far as we can tell. And so I see it at work in my effective opinion. My opinion effectively, I guess if you want to say that. I see this thing going on. I personally believe I do. And perhaps you do too. Because those who believe in the Babylonian system, those who've got their, like those Hellenistic Jews who still wanted, they were pro-Hellenism and they still wanted a part of, God's kingdom or God's, part of the good guys, had their feet in both grounds, on both sides of the fence. But those today, who believe in this Babylonian system, and those who seek to preserve the system so that they can seek to preserve their way of life, are already being influenced by this mystery. What does he call it here? The mystery of lawlessness is already going at work on us. I know it goes to work on me too. It's trying to go to work on me, but I'm trying to, stay grounded in my covenant with Jesus Christ. So if we try to work to preserve your way of life, if you're praying to God saying, save us from our enemies and preserve and maintain our freedoms here, we want this, God's guns and power and all these kinds of stuff, that's not right. So it's not God who's going to preserve the system. The Antichrist will. That's what he's going to come and do. He's the one who's going to preserve the system. I hope that sinks in a little bit. Because many are praying to God for things to be better. And just be careful what you're really asking God to do and why you're asking him to do that. If you are, I don't know. But this nationalist tendencies and Western exceptionalism speaks to that in volumes. And I've sat in churches and I have heard this kind of rhetoric going on all the time. Just in on Bible studies, it's the same old nationalistic ideas. All the time. And I think that's a bigger problem than we ever imagined. So don't place any great hope, okay, in government and bringing about ultimate change. Don't get too put up too much of your energy in that. Do not think your nation is sharing in God's work either. That is not true. Or think that this was or is or will be or could be a just nation or ever was. That's in God's eyes. That's not the way it works. Because if we're going to have these ideas, then we are having a misplaced and idolatrous hope. It's misplaced and it's also idolatrous. The mystery of lawlessness is at work. You don't want to have a false hope in the world systems. Because it's idolatry. And I see this happen a lot. In Christianity, it's not the nations that rid the world of evil. It's God who's going to do it. The nations are far too busy to worry about your problems like this. Far too busy. They're all caught up in many things in terms of economic power, military and nationalist dreams, as they've always been and always will be. But we see this in the Western exceptionalism that seems to have permeated all across much of North America, or in the United States in particular, in Canada. These are very prevalent attitudes in the Church of God. And so it's really, though they profess that it's God who can protect and restore a nation, they can easily fall prey to a leader and a government that professes the same things back to you with flatteries and favors. All kinds of things. Oh, I'll make it okay. The Antichrist is one who comes on the scene and says, I will protect you. Because when it starts falling apart, when all this lawlessness is occurring, this lawless one actually comes on the scene and says, I will protect you. This happened with Hitler and back in Germany with his Third Reich. He came in and says, I will protect you. And he did it very deceptively. So we look at 2 Thessalonians, and we want to pick it up here a little further. And the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. And then he says here, and for this reason God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe in the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And I think this is already happening. Misrepresenting God and his justice is, unrighteousness. If you want other loyalties, the unrighteous thing here he's talking about, if you have loyalties towards the secular world that is beyond what God in your covenant allows, then he's going to send perhaps a strong delusion. We just need to be careful with this. Because we've seen this already started to play. It was played out over 2,000 years ago already. All right. So we see this secular loyalties being played, put God in there with these secular loyalties, and we see it all the time, and I see it, constantly. The Church of God has spawned many of these, and evangelicals of all types. I just saw some video sent to me recently, and he wrote this thing how Trump was God's chosen or, to do come at the time he is. They're all really upset he's not been reelected. But I recently saw a post a number of weeks ago. It was I'm not on this channel, but somebody posted it from their channel onto the one that I was on, and I was reading it. It caught my attention right away. And then it's on a channel called Truth Bites, B-Y-T-E-S. It says here, are we listening? The Western world is facing a crisis, and enemies abound. But how many people are looking to the only real source of deliverance and listening to what the Lord God has to say? Or are too many people absent when God is teaching, even those who say they believe in the God of Scripture and call themselves Christian or Jewish? If we expect God to listen to our prayers for help, he asks us that we listen too and follow his teachings. After all, he gave these instructions to us for our benefit, that we might prosper. All right. It sounds good on the surface, but then the writer of this post goes on to say, quote part of Psalm 81, several verses of Psalm 81, and where the person picked it up was, "Hear, O my people, hear, O my people, and I will admonish you, O Israel, if you would listen to me." All right. Well, this is like, my people. We need to identify who that is. Oh, well, it's Christians now, right? Is that really the case? Is that really, can we make that argument? Let's try to really look at this. But this is just classic Western exceptionalism all over. It's just coated with it by making these statements. The Western world is facing a crisis and enemies abound. Well, I asked the question, I'll put the question to all of you. What enemies is this person referring to? Days of Israel in the Bible, the enemies were pretty well defined. But who are we saying are the enemies today? Is it some sort of race or some nationality or religion? Because if actually what was quoted here in Psalm 81 in the same post said that you shall have no foreign gods. No foreign God shall be among you. So what is the suggestion then? Should we get rid of, as part of listening to God, are we supposed to get rid of Islam and Muslims worshiping Allah in this country? Is that the point? Or any of these other religions? Was that what we're supposed to be doing? If we're going to quote these things, have your answers ready and tell me. Don't make this stuff up. Or is it their politics? I see a lot of that. All the Democrats and all these kinds of things. You can't say there are enemies without some definition of who you're talking about. So if we're going to start pulling in scripture like these and apply them in this manner, we better have our answers. So if we're calling about God for deliverance, what are we asking God to do? What do we want him to do? In that same psalm, verse 14 of that Psalm of 81, verse of Psalm 81, it says the Lord would have, if they were obedient, subdue their enemies, and he would have turned his hands against them. Well, what is it we expect God to do? And I can go into some things in here that are very pleasant and talk about, all this military might of the United States, its capabilities, and what has been done in the past. Do we really want to go there? I don't think it's necessary. David wanted deliverance and told the Lord not to be merciful to his enemies. My goodness. So we really need to be careful here when we're starting throwing around scripture and making these claims. This is what I take a great deal of exception to, because it's misleading, it's misguided, and it's not helpful. As Christians, I thought we were supposed to love our enemies. Last time I checked the notes. All right. So how do we prepare? How do we prepare? Well, in the case what I wanted to do here today was at least have some element of prophetic understanding. Not some misunderstanding. We don't have to know all the things about prophecy. I'm not an expert in prophecy, but I can eventually pull some things together and can look at the previous message. We want to have we want this right. We don't want to be a healthy look at prophecy. So that's one thing. And perhaps put yourself in the history of the Jews and examine that as well, with a sense of special consideration, and trying to appreciate the broader plan of God. Also, know that you have one covenant with God, not two. You haven't got a parallel covenant going on here. You got one covenant with God. If you're tied into the idea, as we talked about many times in this channel, and for good reason, if you're tied with America being the new Israel or something to that effect, or Anglo-Israelism, or anything like that, then you also need to know then that the white race, you're saying the white race as a secondary covenant in parallel with your covenant with Christ. And those that believe that there's one group up in Canada, I think it is, who say it's the highest calling, or to be a covenant with Christ, but also have, if you're a descendant of Israel, then you have a real high calling. You can't have that covenant in parallel. You have one covenant in Jesus Christ, which can only, and if you're running on two, or trying to balance these two, and try to figure these things out, it can only be a bad thing. It can only be a bad thing. And it leads to confusion. It leads to confusion, because then it all of a sudden becomes a part of the loyalties. Well, you say, no, I'm loyal to God. I'm only loyal to God. Well, when you look at the Maccabean revolt, they had two loyalties there. They had that secular loyalty, and then they said they also have this loyalty to the covenant. So it brings about confusion. At the end of the day, if you believe that America is a new Israel, that's a secular thing. That comes very secular in nature, and racist and many other things. That's all bad. Nothing good is coming out of it. So we got to make the distinction, to be honest about where your security is. Is it in Christ or in the nation? Got to figure that out. As Darren highlighted, it's by participation, not observation or casual involvement. And futile Facebook posts is not participation. It's not. Nor is disseminating conspiracy theories or scandals and all these things that are so prevalent today. So that's one thing, or a couple of things. But most importantly, it's those who know their God. Those who know their God, who are intimate with his will. Even though everything was falling apart, and tens of thousands of people were being killed in Israel, and women and children were being taken away, these small group of people, and there's the whole history there in First and Second Maccabees. I think you can read these and read about it, who knew their God and stayed loyal to the one covenant they had. When it all falls apart, as it did in the 2nd century, that's when you're really going to know, right? That's when you're really going to know. Because when it all falls apart, God still expects you to honor your covenant with him, your covenant in Jesus Christ. So we don't want to get anything confused with another covenant, otherwise it just creates obscurity. As that post does, like, what enemies? What am I supposed to do here? What am I supposed to be praying about? I see all these things in Christendom and COG media programs. It's all falling apart, and warnings it's falling apart. Well, that's appealing to people and their security. Like, we got to get band together and start going out to the governments and starting getting involved. And I've seen there was one I talked about recently. I said, this is just creating nothing but fear, and that's what it's doing. Christians can compel governments, communities to do good. There's nothing wrong with that. But you'll only be able to do this well or properly when we can acknowledge and accept that we are resident aliens here. We look to a future home, future kingdom. We are resident aliens here within America or any other nation. We're not synonymous with it, and we're not coterminous with it. Okay? We're not synonymous with this nation, and we're not coterminous with it. Because if we think we are, then our loyalties will be compromised. Our loyalties will be compromised. But, it's up to you. I mean, God wants to test. It's going to put into a test on us. If he has to. If we remain royal, if we're like the Church of the Philadelphia, then perhaps we won't see that as to the degree that much of the world will see. I don't know. And let me be more emphatic about this. If we're not synonymous with or coterminous with the nation we're in, let's just say America. Let's just put this out there to understand it. Even if America became some vision of what, say, a Christian would like to see, or something like that, some beacon of high moral ground, or some kind of revival, and that the nation turned itself around and listened to God, or whatever fanciful ideas that had been proposed, as we read here today. If the nation did that, or it became the worst manifestation of evil in history, that is irrelevant to you as a Christian. It's irrelevant. You're a resident alien here, and we got to understand our expectations carefully in this world. And that's the important thing. And then the Maccabees that knew their God didn't make that kind of mistake. And we don't want to make that mistake. So there's a very powerful lesson in here. So it's not about who's control or who's in the White House. I know there's some people going on about, the election got stolen from Trump and all these kinds of things. It's not about who's controllers in the White House. That's not the point. It's not where the money's going. It's not who's in power, whether Democrats or Republicans or the liberals or the conservatives. That's not what it's all about. It's about knowing who knows their God and knows their covenant with God and will remain loyal to that covenant is what it's all about. And many of the Maccabees were brave and did many exploits. I'm not sure how it will be in the future, but it's a strong and powerful lesson, I think, for us today. So I guess that will close with the following. To be or not to be a Maccabee? That is the question. So, brethren, I hope this sermon was edifying for you, or this message, I should say. And thank you for watching. Be sure to click the like and share the channel or subscribe. As Darren says, tell a friend. But we're going to close out now, and God bless all of you. And we'll see you here next time on Shepherd's Voice Magazine YouTube channel. Take care.